I know many people listening are probably familiar with Big Mind. I'm sure a great number are not. Can you take us and give us a little introduction to how Big Mind works?
Sure. The voice dialogue, its assumption is that everything that is out there is also within us. And these are voices or aspects that are within the self, and they call them subselves or personality patterns within us. And that if you ask to speak to a voice, let's say the voice of anger, for instance, and you say, okay, I am the voice of anger, I speak for anger. I'm not the self, but I am anger, and I'm just that subpersonality. And what I started to notice back 83, 84, when I was doing this work with Hal, particularly Hal Stone, that it gave me enough distance from the self to begin to drop the self. In other words, by identifying with the voice or the subpersonality, I was able to disidentify from my attachment and identification with the self. Now, in Buddhism, we know that the self is illusory. It's a necessary part of our being, but by and large, it's a concept. It's created in the mind. And that the idea that I am who I think I am, we know from Buddhism is not so. And that in Buddhism, the whole point is to drop the self. So I started to see where these two really complemented each other. And that what was happening at the Zen Center in Los Angeles back then was that people, by using the voice dialogue technique, were actually strengthening their Zen practice because they were able to less identify, therefore be less attached to the self, and therefore drop the self in their Zazen practice or in their daily life practice.
Now, let me just ask something for clarification, because you're speaking about disidentifying with the self. Because you were talking about in voice dialogue how you were realizing, in a sense, that your self isn't so much a self as it is a collection of all these different voices, and that it's less a kind of absolute entity as it is a sort of assortment of different characters that at any given point you're identified with. And through doing that, you started to get a kind of more objective look at, well, what is this self? It's obviously not this concrete, tangible me entity that I think it is. Was it something like that?
Absolutely. Again, your insights are superb. Yes, absolutely. So what happens is that by seeing that the self is not solid, substantial, or permanent, we're able to let it go. Let me give you an example for our listeners. I obviously am more attached to my children than I would be to any of our listeners' children. And they would be more attached to their children than they are to my children. That's obvious. I'm also more attached to my notions, ideas, and beliefs than I would be to yours. Vice versa. You're more attached to your own ideas, beliefs, and concepts than you are to mine. The more identified we are with anything, the more attached we are to it. So I'm more attached to my own beliefs and concepts than I am to anybody else's. Therefore, when I'm that attached, that's what hangs me up, causes suffering, causes dukkha, and causes me to feel alienated or frightened or whatever else, and I suffer because of that. So the more distance I can create between, let's call it the true self, and the self that is limited and created, the more attached I'm going to be, therefore the more I'm going to suffer. And let me give an example. Like, if we take the voice of fear, and I speak from that voice of fear, what we're going to see, as soon as I start to talk as the voice of fear, I'm going to speak as the voice of fear, well, I'm the voice that my job is to be frightened. And what my job is, and my purpose is to protect Genpo, or warn him in a protective way that there's danger present, that this is dangerous to approach that bear right there, or to get too close to the edge, or to drive his motorcycle too fast, or to cut in and out of cars. I am here to serve a purpose, but I'm not Genpo. I'm the voice of fear. And by doing this, by this little exercise, what I see is that the self without me is pretty stupid. The self,
right,
without me, he would be fearless. And he thinks he wants to be fearless. He actually goes to workshops, does all this study and all this practice for years and years and years because he wants to be fearless. But where would he be without me? He would be unprotected and unwarned when there was ever-present danger. The same thing with anger. If I'm the voice of anger, I see that I work to serve Genpo. When somebody wrongs him or does something, I get angry. I'm able to help him make a change, to shift his life in a way that works for him. And without me, he doesn't know how to be angry. You know, he's just without anger. Or protector. As the protector, I'm here to protect him. You know, he would do the stupidest things without me, here to protect him. So what we find out is the self is not that bright. You know, there may be an intelligent aspect of the self, the one that has wisdom, the one that has intelligence, that voice. But the self itself is just a conglomerate of voices, and apart from all these voices, there is no self. And that's basic Buddhism.